Okay. Councilmember Santiago.
Yes, and thank you very much. So I'm trying to figure out and struggling with how to get to ideas or ways of incorporating more underrepresented communities into the UC system. Okay. So just to give you some background, I once served as the president of the LA Community College Board, one of the largest community colleges in the nation, and we struggled with certain demographics and how to get folks in. But then we were creative. We did bridge programming. We did proper testing and placement, wraparound support services. I mean, we did all the different things that we thought we can do in best practices to prepare, recruit, retain, and to ensure that folks were successful at the end of this path. And so sometimes, and not in this conversation, but in other conversations I've had with the UC system, there isn't that sort of, hey, let's think innovative in terms of how we can create some sort of program to help. And there, I'm not saying there hasn't been some programming, but when we take a look at, let's say, for example, the top percent of students that you take, and I think we pinned it about 9%, and certainly that'll leave out a lot of lower income communities just by default and by things said here, right? What are some things that can be done that are creative so that if it's 9% or 11% or whatever that percentage is, let's just agree that it's 9 and that's all it'll be, that it could be done differently so that we capture the kind of students that we've been intending to capture? Because I think sometimes in the conversations of the UC system, there is some frustration around not being able to do some of the things that we would hope to be done because there is a Prop 209. But nonetheless, let's say preference to race, if that's what you want to call, or that's what we want to call it for this conversation, couldn't be taken into account. Could there be something that targets low income students because there are other barriers? And even as some of my colleagues had mentioned, you don't have AP courses in some areas. What can we do? Because I don't have data in front of me, and I don't know what that data means, and I don't know what the 9% really means unless I really look through it. But let's say a parallel the areas that we were trying to recruit in legally, obviously after Prop 209, but we just can't because certain tools don't exist in certain communities. Are there things that the UC system can help us to think creatively to do? Are there regional approaches? When you're taking a look at instead of top 9% across the state of California high schools, can you take a look at 9% across regions? Because we know that that'll capture then the type of students that we want to be able to capture into these universities. And 9% is not a lot, right? I mean, 9%, and I'll just pick on LA County, right? But 9% in Beverly Hills is very different and looks very different than the 9% in South LA, than the 9% in East LA, than the 9% in Pacoima. And so sometimes when we struggle with this question, it's, for me anyways, and I've had this conversation with some of my colleagues around the table, it isn't so much an issue of representation of different cultures. Sometimes it's an issue of different cultures, but also the opportunities that we want to provide certain communities, be they what we call traditionally white, brown, black, or what have you. I would be okay with a different version that helps working class communities irregardless, but what are those kind of things? Because sometimes, and let's create a hypothetical situation that someone can come to us from the UC system and say, look, we're doing really good. We got 25% cultural diversity. And then I take a look and they all come from, quote unquote, the more affluent, well-to-do communities. Well, my opinion would be not much has been done, because those students were going to have access to those higher education institutions anyhow by virtue of the tools around them that poor kids don't have. And so sometimes I'm hoping that in this conversation you can help us, and even if not now, but at least to try to strive at what can we do to help those lower working class communities. If you were to take a look at, let's say, affirmative action programs, and I know specifically what they were designed for, right? And we all know around the table. But if you take a little deeper look, it was also those communities who were of low income traditionally. Now, take the spirit for 1 second of how to help or achieve low-income communities. And if we were to take that tiny spirit, and I'm not going to take away race and class and the things that happened in our history, but if you were to take the tiny little spirit of it, now what can we do today to still address those lower working in-class communities, given the obstacles, but knowing that they can do well once they enter the UC system? I say that because, look, I grew up in a Section 8 housing. And I didn't do well in high school. Probably didn't do too well in community college. And I was a benefactor of of affirmative action programs. So I entered UCLA. This is the first opportunity that I had to do to where I had tutoring, where I had wraparound support services, where I can focus on my education, and I graduated 3.96. So when I take a look at some of these communities where maybe a student doesn't have a 3.96, a 4.0, they can't get in. Look, and I wouldn't consider myself necessarily the smartest guy, but I won't say I'm the dumbest guy either. But I had an opportunity that we're now providing to students that come from similar backgrounds. And so for me, the challenge is how do we do that today? And I think that's what I struggle with, and to some degree, some frustration, and at least for me, I'll speak, with the UC system to help us to get there. Because there are a lot of students like myself that will never have an opportunity given the current laws that we have today. So we just have to think creatively.
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've raised all the important issues. I think all of us, and I got a million ideas, and you don't have enough time. But there are a lot of initiatives that I think our faculty have initiated that have been quite creative. Comprehensive review, in particular, also speaks to challenges that students face, whether that be low income or other things, and those who, not just because they're low income, but because they have challenged themselves, certainly an important part. The top 9%, I think, is also, as far as a national initiative, very important. But I think the real key, and I think you hit on it, is community colleges. California has the largest community college system on the planet. 20% of all community college students in America go to a California community college. And it's the most diverse higher education system as well. I think the Pathways initiative that the Academic Senate has led is a very, very important start for the University of California. And the reason I say community colleges are maybe the key is because not only just because of the diversity, but they also, students there don't face the same kinds of obstacles that I think Assemblymember Medina indicated earlier in terms of testing, in terms of an SAT. We don't ask students from a community college to present an SAT score or even their high school grades. If they've done 2 years at a community college and done well, we're going to take them. So that's a place where I don't think we have tapped the diversities there, and that's a place where I think we can be increasingly creative, and we could look to you for advice and counsel in that regard.
Well, that's where we need, in some cases, at least the UC's willingness. I know that it's there, and sometimes these aren't the best places to demonstrate that, right? But sometimes the willingness to say, okay, look, this is what we can do through particular pathway programs. And I did read it. I realized you guys have pathway programs, and I know when I was on campus, got way too long that I like 20 years or so, right, that I've been on campus. But nonetheless, where they had those kind of programs. But today, what can we do outside of a budget that is specific to saying this is what's going to happen? So that if I'll pick on where I went to school, UCLA, and the LA community area, or I take a look at, let's say I take a look at LACCD because I know it, and I were to say, look, we're going to create a pathway program that at Southwest or South LA campus, we're going to do this, and we know that based on certain metrics that certain students are going to come through these doors from that community college, and they'll eventually end up in the UC system. And I think those kind of creative programs we could take a look at, but unless we have something concrete or something that we can expand or grow on, then we're going to have this challenge every single year on the budget, on policy, and we'll be having the same conversation 4 or 5 years from now.
Yeah. Well, I hope not. And UCLA is a fabulous example. It's a highly selective institution, one of the most highly selective in America, that takes fully a third of their students as transfer students. You don't see that elsewhere. They want to do more. I know that the university wants to do more in this regard as well. But I completely take your point. I think the key is community college transfer, and I think that's where we can be increasingly creative. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. Okay, with that, we're going to go to our last presenter, Professor Samuels.
So I'll try to be brief. So I think a lot of the issues we've been talking about, or we've been talking around about, I don't think it's been frustrating for me because I think there's certain factors we have to look at. So the history that we've talked about is the state, for various reasons, cut the funding to the UC. Substituting general fund support with Cal grants is not the same thing. It's not direct funding for the institution. So it's not an exact substitution. I understand it costs the state as much, but it does create a certain problem. And that problem was filled by non-resident tuition. But what happened is that the campuses that had previously, over decades, gotten much more state support and tuition dollars because of an unequal funding policy, were able to bring in many more non-resident students. And so the result was that the campuses that are highly selective, like Berkeley, UCLA, San Diego, were able to bring in many more non-resident students than the other campuses, which meant they were able to bring in much more money. And so we have really a separate and unequal funding system, where the campuses which have the highest number of underrepresented students are receiving the lowest level of per student funding. And it's gotten much worse, and it's going to get worse this year because I think the legislature and the governor came up with a very bad policy. They allowed non-resident tuition to increase 8% this year and 8% next year, so it's about $25,000 extra you get per non-resident student. And they froze in-state tuition. And so the result is, think of it, you're telling the UC, okay, we're going to give you $25 million if you increase your California residence enrollment by 5,000. So that's $5,000 per student for 1 year. You're going to do a one-time $25 million increase. Well, if the UC, instead of enrolling 5,000 students from California, enrolls an additional 5,000 students from elsewhere and gets $25,000 extra per year over 4 years, that is $500 million. So you're asking the university to exchange potential $500 million for $25 million. So I don't understand how that policy on any level makes sense. And on top of it, you're attaching strings. So why would the university take that deal? Why would they take so much less money with strings attached when they can continue to take in more non-resident students? Now, on the university side, I think it's disingenuous on two levels. One is that the money that they're bringing from non-resident tuition, say if you have 35, 40% of your students coming in from non-resident students at Berkeley, UCLA, and San Diego, that money doesn't get shared with the California students from the other campuses. There's no revenue sharing. There's no sense. I mean, you're bringing in more revenue from non-resident tuition, but that's not being used to support California students. That's being used to support the students at UCLA and Berkeley and San Diego. So unless you have a revenue sharing system, I don't see how the university can make the argument that the non-resident students help to subsidize the California students. And the other thing is that we've seen is the UC, yes, is complying to the master plan, but I think it's accepting 15,000 students who did not apply to Merced this year and accepting them at Merced. And last year, only 2% of those students accepted. So I'm not trying to put down Merced, but I'm trying to look at the numbers and the facts, that this is kind of a false compliance with the master plan, because on some level, the university must know that 98% or a vast majority of the students are not going to accept those offers. And so non-resident tuition kind of distorts everything. It distorts our ability to fund students. A lot of studies say that the underrepresented students need the most amount of support and funding, and they're getting the least amount. And so while the governor has moved to try to equalize funding through K through 12, we have an unequal system in higher education, and it's getting worse, especially in the UC system. So I think I'll give you 5 recommendations. One is to develop some type of revenue sharing system for non-resident tuition for the UC system. I think you have to go back to having some type of enrollment targets. I don't understand why the governor doesn't want to do that. You have to have some type of marginal cost of instruction. There was AB 94. I don't think the university gave an effective response to that. So we don't know how much things cost, and we don't have targets of who we're enrolling. And the final thing, which I think is the most important, is there's no agreement of what the state is actually supporting. Are you supporting? Okay. Are you supporting research? Are you supporting medical education? We were told in the UC's response to AB 94 that it costs $250,000 per year to educate a medical student. Is the state paying for that? How much of that should the state pay? So I think that if the university really, if the state really wants to have an effect on these issues, it has to really look at the hard numbers, and it has to look at the financial aspects, and it has to, I think, give more money to the UC, but in terms, put some requirements on it so that it can help to make the system more equal. Because otherwise, you're just going to have the wealthy campuses where the wealthy students go get more money, and the poorest campuses where the poor students go get less money.
Okay. lot of food for thought there. I wanted to just go back to the premise on the budget, and this past year we were able to make significant increases in higher education in both the UC and the CSU system, not because we like UC and CSU better this year, or you had some fabulous testimony. Just it's the economy. Sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And in years past, we had to make horrific cuts. And the last couple years, we were able to make some increases. The last 2 years were modest. This past year was finally a significant increase. Granted, it hasn't replaced all that was lost. But I still don't get how, even during those lean years when California basically had to cut back on all kinds of programs, including higher ed, along with things like childcare, took the worst cuts during the recession. That when the UC made their fee hikes and when the state of California backfilled that money for Cal Grant, how was that still not a fungible dollar for dollar in your eyes? I don't get it.
Well, after that first year, right, the UC looks at it and says, okay, we're getting $2.6 billion from the state. We used to get $3.8. They're giving us an additional, say, $700 million through Cal Grants, but they're not giving it to us. And they're also telling us to freeze tuition. So you're freezing tuition, and you're giving this money to the students. So the university,
they weren't freezing tuition for those years. They were increasing tuition.
But once the last 3 years, there's been a tuition freeze. Mm-hmm. So in the last 3 years, I'm really talking about
the table.
In the last 3 years, you're freezing tuition, so the UC can bring in less money from California students, and you're giving more money to the California students, but that money is not going directly to the university. So
but it does. It goes to the UC. They get the money.
They don't get more money.
But it goes to the UC. It's a dollar for dollar. It's the same amount going.
From the UC's perspective, no. They're getting $2.6 billion, right? Mm-hmm. And the students are getting $800 million. So their last 3 years, I mean, it's increased 4% because the governor. And
but the years where they didn't, let's go back to 2011-12. They got $688 million in financial aid, whereas 5 years earlier they were getting about $300 million. So
I agree. The state is giving more money, but I'm wondering if it's giving money in the most, if Cal Grant substitution is the most effective way to do it.
Okay.
Because
I think that's for another day. But the bigger issue on enrollment, I just have two kind of the big question in the room is that, the researcher earlier says that these actions, not just at UC but across the nation, they limit access on students from the state, particularly students in lower income populations, in communities of color. And then the UC, we hear over the past year is that no, this helps us keep us afloat, and it actually creates more access. And so we're missing something. And so, maybe you can help, if you can, from the UC, succinctly illuminate why that the research and, frankly, the collective wisdom from this body, what are we missing?
Well, I think there's a clear case to be made, and a positive one for the university, in the sense that although there has been increases in non-resident enrollment, the plain fact of the matter is we've increased the number of the number of low-income students, first-generation students from low API high schools. Where we haven't been as successful, clearly, is with underrepresented minority students, African Americans, Chicano Latinos, American Indian. Interestingly, the professor's research points out that in states where there is a ban on affirmative action, those numbers actually went down for highly selective institutions across the country. But at the University of California, those numbers went up or stayed the same. Mm-hmm. So my argument, and again I'm a biased one, would be that despite a ban on affirmative action in California, we've nevertheless been able to maintain and hold our own in that regard, despite increasing the number of students from non-residents.
The follow-up to that, regardless of the characteristics, the number of students hasn't increased. If you look at the number of non-resident students in the system, it has gone up significantly in the last few years. And the number of California students has not. And so
Well, it's inched up. I mean, it's about 1%, and for transfers, it's up 18% since 2007. So I grant you, it hasn't grown nearly at the same level as our non-resident students. Absolutely.
But isn't that the promise that you kind of made to the state, is that, hey, allow us to do this. It's going to help us make the system whole and expand access. And the numbers show that we haven't had. You would think you would have an increase in California enrollment as well when you see the huge increase in out-of-state enrollment.
Certainly the president has said she wants to increase California residents. I know that she's speaking and working with the chancellors on a plan on that. I know that the legislature has been very supportive of that as well in the most recent budget. So I suspect that's going to be one of her main aims.
And that's also a nice segue to this issue. I know that Mr. Ting somewhat addressed this, and you somewhat answered it. And we heard from the president at lunch. She spoke to a group of us who represent a UC in our districts. And so I'm one of them. I have a teaching hospital in my district. And the budget that was passed, we had this, as the professor alluded to, an offer, for lack of better terms, that $25 million on the table to further enrollment for 5,000 undergraduate California students, knowing that it's not $5,000 per student, that you probably need to double that to fully address the cost. But we think there's other ways you can do it, whether it's addressing issues at the system-wide level, talking about the issue we found out in last year's budget discussions with the financial aid that was provided from out-of-state, the going to out-of-state students that we thought maybe should be focused on expanding enrollment here in California. So I guess the question is, where is the UC on the proposal? Did you have an official answer?
I really don't. You've got the admissions guy. They give me the targets, and I fill the seats. But with that said, however, I don't want to be cavalier. I know that the president takes the legislative intent very seriously, as do the chancellors in the region. So I know that they're studying that. I know they're working on a variety of proposals, and I understand that they're going to be reporting back very soon on that.
Is there a timeline as far as
6 to 8 weeks is what I believe I heard, but I'd have to double check with staff to make sure. But very soon.
So in this fall,
yes,
the UC will say what their plans are to do with that potential $25 million and 5,000 target.
Yeah, they're exploring a lot of options. Again, the president is committed to increasing California resident enrollment. How that happens, in what ways, on what campuses. It's 9 campuses trying to coordinate that work. I'm sure it's very, very difficult, but I know that she's very interested in doing that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we don't have any other member questions up here, but we do have the opportunity for the public to engage if they wish to. We're going to have a microphone at the center up there, so please come on up, and if you can, please hold your comments to 2 minutes or less.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Kevin Sabo. I'm a fourth year at UC Berkeley, and I'm the newly elected president of the UC Student Association. And I just wanted to share some thoughts and observations from the hearing today. One about the funding. I think a lot of members have spoken to this, that it's one thing to say that there has been an increase to grant aid, but there are a lot of other costs, and there are a lot of student support services, and there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be included when we increase or we make requirements and demands of the UC to increase student enrollment. There are students on campuses that I speak to every day who are living in parking lots, who are living in offices. There's a real crisis of housing and access to classes and access to support services, and it's not to say that we can just cram 5,000 more students. So I encourage the legislature and the UC to be more imaginative in how we incorporate those increases to students. I also wanted to speak to the issue about diversity, that I heard a lot about how I guess to sum it in one way, more cynically, is that we have diversity, we have Riverside, we have Merced. Students want to apply to other campuses than Merced and Riverside for different reasons. I'm from the Central Valley. I didn't want to stay in the Central Valley. I wanted to go to the Bay Area. I didn't want to go to Southern California. So to say that it's okay, we can move these students off to Riverside and Merced and pretend that makes us more diverse, I think is a little cheap, and we need to be more imaginative in how we can incorporate different students, specifically students of color, at the campuses that are more, I forget the euphemistic term that was used, but campuses like Berkeley and LA and San Diego. And lastly, just to speak to, I guess this kind of goes with the diversity point that UCSA is really excited that we've added the diversity questions or the gender questions and the sexual orientation questions to the UC application. We think that it's going to do a better job to inform questions related to resources and facilities and things like that. But I did want to conclude that I'm pretty disappointed as a member of the public that there are 18 individuals between the Higher Education Committee and the Budget Subcommittee, and there is a single member of the Assembly here chairing the meeting. That it's really disappointing as a member of the public to come here to sit through very, very many hours, especially as a student, of individuals talking about students, but students and members of the public not having the opportunity to engage folks who are around this table. So again, this is the second time that I've thanked Assemblymember McCarthy for being one of the only people left. So thank you for winning the Perfect Attendance Award and for being here. But I really hope that the 17 other individuals who are here really step up their attendance game and really just show some respect for public comment. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. With that, we will adjourn.